So first up on this guy is the skin. And as you can see here, I base coated the whole model in Afro Shadow because he's a sort of tree creature and I wanted that underlying sort of reddish brown all over, and I can use this Afro Shadow for lots of the colours on this model as a base coat. So I'm coming in first of all here with Russian green, which is a really cool sort of camo green. And I'm painting all the areas in this and leaving some of that Afro Shadow colour. Now where it's showing here, I've mixed up an intermediate colour, which is Afro Shadow and Russian green, about 50-50. I thinned this down a little bit and I'm just sort of feathering between the two layers, which will give us that nice blend and that nice sort of transition from the dark to the lighter green tone. Now, once I've got this all done, I start adding in more and more green ochre. And as you can see here, I'm sort of concentrating more into the upper areas of each little section and around these little faces. So in this skin, you can see there's some like, it's almost like you see this in horror films sometimes, these sort of ghostly faces that are pushing through the skin. And I take my time here just to paint the features of those little faces and make them stand out a little bit so that they're easy to read. Now, in between all this, I do the same as I did with the base tone. I mix up these in-between colours to sort of blend in the gradients between the previous layer and the new layer. And as you can see, we're building up to that much sort of lighter, more of a sort of ochre-y sort of tone. And as I progress through this, one thing that sort of happens in all my painting really is my paints get more and more dilute the higher the value of the paint. So as I progress through these paints, my paints get thinner and a little bit more dilute, and I also load the brush less and less the more I go through. Right near the end here, you see I'm coming in with some glazes now of the green ochre, and this is just going to help sort of unify a lot of the layers, homogenizes them, as Jose would say, and it gives that smoothing effect across the board. I come back in with some green ochre here just to reinforce those highlights that I may have lost. And this is sometimes we get this back and forth effect where we'll glaze and then come back in with the highlights and then go back and glaze again and then just keep reinforcing where there needs a little bit more of a highlight. And the final touches here are just very small parts for the highlights. So for the face, there's really, what I want to capture here is those bright red glowing eyes. So I come in first of all with quite a thin mix with matte red, and I paint the eyes and all around the eyes here. So we want that glowing effect to be the sort of reddish colour. Now I paint the eyes themselves in deep orange, which is a really nice sort of bright orangey tone. I do the inside of the mouth as well. Then I come in with yellow and I paint most of the eye with the yellow. And then the final touch for the highlights is I'm mixing in white, so I get this very bright yellowy white colour to give some very extreme light, which is going to stand out a lot. And then the final step is to come back in at the end with the deep orange and glaze them. So for the next part of the model, I'm calling it the hair, but I'm not really quite sure what this part is, but I'm sort of painting it as hair. Over this Afro Shadow base coat, I'm coming straight in with Beast Brown, and I'm painting the main areas of what would be the hair. So I'm not picking out individual strands at this point. I'm actually sort of trying to get the little zones of light and highlight, whatever we want to call them, in the right places. Now, once I've got this all in the right place, I then come in with, I start adding in more and more yellow and start painting smaller and smaller areas. It's only really the last steps, like when I get nearer these last points, when I'm actually what I would say is called painting the actual fine hairs. We save that for the very lightest layers, but we need those main areas of light underneath all in place before we get to the finer lines. If we do it right from the beginning, it just doesn't look quite right. And it just looks like a very liney mess. But if we get all the underlying colours right in the first place, then these lines will look good. I do some glazing as well here with some Beast Brown, just to sort of soften and flatten it out and unify the colours a bit. And then once I've got this all done, I'm going to come back in with that yellow mix just to give the very brightest parts a little bit more of a highlight. Now, one of the fun parts about this model is he's got this big sort of Nurgle-like mouth on the side of his belly. And I've already painted the teeth here, and this is painting the tongue. So the first thing I did, I mixed up Bordeaux Red with Afro Shadow, which is our shadow colour that we're using all over. And I painted the bulk of the tongue with this. And what I'm going to do here is I sort of add more and more buff, but there's sort of two parts of this tongue. There's sort of like the outer wrapping part, which I'm going to keep as the Bordeaux Red buff type mix. And then there's like an inner sort of sleeve part of the tongue, which we're going to send more to a yellowy tone. Making sure we paint all the little vein parts. And sorry, my head is going to pop in on a couple of the shots throughout the video. I've actually sort of moved my studio around and I couldn't quite get my camera in the right place, so I've cut it out where I can. Once I get all those highlights in place, this is like a wash of dirty red, and this is just to give that little bit more contrast and slightly more reddish tone to that tongue. And then I come in with the Bordeaux Red mix and add in yellow to build up the main colour of this inner part of the tongue. I actually re-highlight a lot of the vein parts as well when I'm doing this, just to give them a little bit more contrast and to stand out a little bit more against that red background. So a couple of parts of the model, mainly at the top here, there's some different types of what I would call vines, not sort of branches, but they're more like vines. So I wanted to paint these in more of a sort of greeny yellowy tone. So I've used two colours here, again on top of the Afro Shadow. I mixed up Grim Brown with a little bit of Japanese Brown, which is a really good sort of a muddy-ish yellow-green colour. And I've painted all the main parts of this with that. Then I added in a little bit of Grim Brown to the mix, and then I blended in between the main shadow and that first mid-tone colour that we put on. Now, as I work through this, I've added more Japanese Brown into the mix here, and we're now looking to sort of pick out the main areas that are either facing upwards or going to be sticking out a bit. Now, certain areas like here, I paint, the whole thing is sticking up, but I paint more towards the front. So this gives us that bit of contrast there and creates more visual interest in that part. I carry on going with adding in more and more Japanese brown here, and you can really see the dark outline that I've left around this. And this is really important when we're painting elements on the model, is that, you know, we used to call this black lining or dark lining, but we do it now by working up from a very dark tone and leaving that tone around those edges and not, you know, painting over them, so that it gives us that outline and effect, and it saves us going back in later and doing actual black lining. Now I build up nearly all the way to Japanese brown here, and as you can see, we're getting more of that sort of yellowy green tone, which stands out nicely against the more desaturated, more sort of a whitish green tone of the body. The final steps here was with pure Japanese brown, diluted down to probably about 7 or 8 parts water to paint, and I glaze over 3 or 4 times here just to smooth it out and give it a little bit more of a yellowy tone. Now for the crown of thorns, I want to paint these again as a wood or natural element, but I need a slightly different tone here. So first tone I'm adding on here is a colour called mahogany, which is a little bit more of a sort of yellowy, peachy sort of brown. And I thought this would work well to just give us that variation in tone, because there's lots of wood on the model. And we obviously want to break this up and give it some different sort of shades and hues. Now, once I've got the first layer of the mahogany in here, I just progressively add more and more buff, which is that sort of yellowy white tone, to build up more and more of the highlights. And I focus on the upper areas and the areas towards the front of the model here, which is, it's going to help it stand out more, and it's going to push the focus, you know, more towards the front and towards the face especially, which is what we want people to look at on this model. So, painting the loin cloths on this guy. So this is a good opportunity to use this sort of pinky red spot colour like we have on the tongue. So for these, I'm coming in with a mix of Afro Shadow and Bordeaux Red, which is the same sort of pinky red we used in the tongue, but we're going to sort of push the tone slightly different here, keep it more in that pinky field rather than push it more to a red. Now I paint all the areas which I feel are sticking up and sticking out, and leave that Afro Shadow clearly showed in the shadows. Now once I've got that in place, I get a mix here and in between tone again, and I thin this down quite a lot and just feather between those two tones. I always describe it as it just blurs the edges, which creates that smooth transition between the two colours. We're not really affecting one side or the other with the tone here, because we sort of keep the area of highlight and shadow about the same. It's just that area between the two colours which we're blending out with these thin mixes, which causes this blur and effect. Now once I've got that in place, I come in with pure thin down Bordeaux Red here, and this is where we can sort of add a little bit of saturation to this quite a sort of desaturated model. We don't want to overdo it, but I want to get those sort of pinkish tones in there, which are just going to give us that little flash of colour. Now we do the same thing here, where I blend in between the two layers by mixing some of the previous tone into the current tone, and like I said, it's quite thin down, so as I brush over this you don't see a lot of difference for the first 1 or 2 times, but once you've gone over it 3 or 4 times you really start to see that blending of the two tones. Now once that blending's in place, I add a little bit of buff into this, which is the colour we used earlier in a couple of places. And this is going to increase the value on those raised areas and the bits that are really sort of looking upwards towards the light. So that's going to give us this really good tone for the highlights, and really it creates a nice bit of contrast. But as you can see here, I don't overdo it in too many places, just in a few places where it's going to stand out and give us that visual interest. The last step here is to glaze several times with Bordeaux red, which gives us a lovely smoothing effect, and just homogenises all the colours together. Now we're painting all the gravestones and the huge piece on his back, which I'm calling a mausoleum. I'm not sure what it really is, but seeing as he's a graveyard piece, that sort of makes sense to me. So over again the Afro shadow, I've made a mix of graphite and Afro shadow here, and I'm painting on the sort of main colour, what we might call the mid-tone, which is the main colour. Now once I got all in place, I do my blending mix again, and again, sorry about my head being in the picture on a couple of shots here, guys. And we blend the sort of grey and the brown together with that in-between tone. Now once I've got that all blended and how I want it to look, I actually come back in with a pure layer of graphite here, and again painting on the highlights and keeping the lights more towards the top of all the areas of this stonework. It doesn't need a lot of stone, bricks and things like that, because it's not a highly contrasted element. We just need enough to give us the definition in those objects and elements. Now we're painting all the dark wood elements on this model, and I wanted to do something a little bit different here to sort of not just do a straight brown. So the first mix here is I'm actually rebase coating this with Afro shadow and black, but I do it quite lightly because we've already got that dark colour of Afro shadow underneath. So if a little bit shows through in places, that's absolutely fine. This is not meant to be a super clean, pure thing we're painting. It is going to be a little bit chaotic in places. Now, for the difference here, with that mix, I start adding in mint green from AK Interactive, which is a very saturated, minty bright green. And what this is going to do, it's going to create, because we've got a lot of black in here, it creates this unusual looking greyish tone. But it's a sort of chromatic grey, because it's quite colourful in a way, but also quite desaturated in another way. It is a grey, of course, but it has got colour in it. And we're going to develop that colour into the smallest highlights, as you can see here, with that mint green. And this is one thing I'd always say to people is, like, when you're painting anything a black or a very dark grey, don't just use black or white, because it looks very sort of stale and lifeless. Whereas this sort of grey, and you can do it with a number of different colours, it doesn't have to be minty green, but it adds a lot more visual interest and it's a lot more eye-catching. So once I got to a certain point here, I added more mint green in to paint these little like pustules and sort of almost boil type bits. And this bit in this sort of sack thing at the back, with a lot more of the mint green in this mix. Now, I keep adding more and more mint green here, because I want these parts to really stand out, and this is how we create contrast, by having more sort of dull, desaturated areas next to really vibrant, bright areas on the model. As you can see, this really stands out a lot when we're painting it. Now, to push the lights on really further with this, I add in fluorescent yellow from AK at the end here, which is, it's about the brightest yellow tone I could find in their range. And this really does push the saturation a lot. So we're on to another red element of the model now, and you're starting to see where I've gone with the colour combinations here. There's a lot of red and green throughout this model, and anyone who knows their colour rule knows that red and green are the perfect complements to each other. But when we're painting a model like this, we don't just paint a certain red and a certain green. You know, as you've seen on the model, we've already got, you know, 3 or 4 totally different greens, and now we're into like our second or third totally different red. Now this is a much more what we call a standard red, where I've put the first layers of this model on with burnt red, which is a really nice dark sort of brownish red. I blended it in between by sort of adding the afro shadow in here, and then just again softening those edges like we've done before on the model. And this gives us that nice blend between the darkest shadows and the mid-tone. Now to the burnt red, I've added in matte red. And what we're going to start doing now is building up those highlights and following this blending in between each layer, mainly more on the big flag at the back and the top one, so that we get the nice smooth transitions between each of these layers without looking like there's too big a jump, but still keeping the contrast of light to dark. Now, one of the things you notice here with this red, it turns out a really nice sort of bright red this in the end. But this is one of the secrets to painting red, is to highlight with red. So I always find if I end up adding yellows or whites into a red to highlight, you always have to glaze the red back in to actually make it look red, because it becomes overpowered with the orange or the pink tone. But if you start from much darker reds like the burnt red I did here, you can just highlight up to your sort of highest value red, which was matte red in this case, and you end up getting a very sort of true looking red at the end of the stage. I'm glazing here with the matte red, just trying to smooth the transitions in and push the red colour to the max where I can, so that the naked eye is going to read this as a really nice sort of well balanced red. So now we're going to be painting his sort of red, sorry, not red, his rope belt, all the way around his middle here. Now I've come in first of all here with a mix of tan earth and Japanese brown. Again, it is a sort of brownish tone, so we're keeping a lot of these things in neutral tones. Now once I've got that in place, I add in some of the afro shadow again, and I just blend around the edges of each of these little sort of, I suppose, knobs of the rope. And this just blends those two colours in and gives it a nice sort of smoothing effect. Now once I've got that all smoothed out, I'm adding in tan yellow. I do this in a couple of steps just to build up a little bit of highlight on each of these sections. And I do blend in between these as well with the method I've outlined earlier of mixing in the previous colour and just going around the edges. And all I do is I look for where I can see those brush lines in between the two and just smooth them out. I sort of finish this off with almost tan yellow on its own, but a lot more diluted. Now on to one of my favourite elements to paint on any model, and that is gold. So we're trying to do a little bit more of a sort of not such a yellowy gold this time, more like an antique or an older gold. So I've taken my afro shadow and I've mixed in a little bit of Japanese brown here. And what we end up doing is getting this a little bit of a sort of mid-tone yellowy brown. Actually, I think it was beast brown that I mixed in with the first mix, excuse me. And what we do here is we build up these lovely mid-tones of yellowy brown colours, which gives us that really nice sort of feeling to a gold. Now, I believe that sort of like NMMs and golds is all about the mid-tones. We end up with very small dark shadows and very small bright highlights, and the rest of it is a lovely transition through these lovely mid-tone colours. Now, when we add the final highlights, that's when we get, you know, those bright elements and the sparkle. So I build up more and more with this colour, adding in more and more Japanese brown as I go, and blending in between like we've done previously. So it's important to adjust as you go here. So if you feel like a mid-tone or a highlight is too big or too small, it's best to change it when you are, rather than leaving it till the end. So a couple of elements on the bells here, I sort of push the mid-tone out a little bit further because they were getting a bit too small too early. And this helps to give, I want to see more of that mid-tone in these gold objects. Now, once I get all my placement right, it's then a case of, once I reach Japanese brown on its own, I then start adding in more and more pale yellow. And this is where we get into those whiter tones, which help to sell, you know, that effect of a gold on these elements. And as you can see here, a lot of these elements, these highlights, get very, very small, which is what we need to sell that metallic effect. Going over these, I thin the paint more and more as I get lighter and lighter here as well. So I'm having to put quite a few layers on in certain places to actually get the brightness in those areas. Now, right at the end here, I'm really only painting little dots with almost pure yellow. And again, I may have to go over some of these several times. And then right at the end, I sort of make a glaze of Japanese brown, which is diluted very, very thin. It's probably 8 to 10 parts paint to water. And I'm brushing over this maybe sort of 7 to 10 times, making sure I leave it to dry in between each one. And this gives us that lovely smoothing effect on the surface of each of these elements. Now we're on to painting all the steel parts, and a very similar process and principles as the gold. I've got that sort of afro shadow mix in as the base, and I'm adding in dark blue grey with black here to produce the first sort of mid-tones we're going to have. And as you can see here, we leave that darker colour underneath showing. And we're building up towards a bluish whitish tone as we progress through the colours. Dark blue grey is a really good colour for steel, and I'm adding in ice yellow to it, not white, which is, ice yellow has got a lot of white in it and it's a very high value, but it really makes those highlights a much more interesting tone than if we were just adding in white. The model that we're going to show in the video, and that is his big fingernails. Now I wanted these to have a sort of shiny, glossy sort of look, if I could. Now, once again, we've left the afro shadow as our shadow colour. And as I said at the beginning, this works for nearly every element that we're going to paint on the model. So we haven't had to sort of re-base coat too many elements here. Now, to the Afro shadow, I added in green ochre to paint that first sort of mid-tone, the main areas of light. And what I'm going to want to do is to pick out a few areas on these nails, mainly the areas that are looking up, forward, or sticking out, like the edges of some of these nails, and build those up to a really bright tone. So we get that almost sort of enamel, sort of polished look to them if we can. Now, in between all these layers, I'm doing as I did before. I'm mixing a bit of the previous colour and come back and blend in between the layers. And this helps us to give that really nice smooth effect throughout painting these elements. Now, once I've built up to a pure green ochre, which I think I am at here, once we've got to that stage, we then need to start adding whiter colours so that we can get the brightness of value in those extreme highlights. And for this, I start adding in more and more ice yellow, which is one of those colours I use quite a lot for highlighting. And I use this because it's a very high value on the value scale. It's not far off white, but it's got enough yellow in it to keep it still within the bounds of a yellow. But when we're highlighting anything, that we do, you'll notice that I very rarely use white, as this tends to desaturate a lot of things as we paint them, and then it's very hard to keep colour in a model. And as you can see with these elements, although I'm painting something very bright here, it's still keeping that sort of ochre yellowy tone, which is what I'm looking for in these elements. Now, when we get near the end here, it's very small dots of this colour that I'm painting, and this is giving us those real extreme highlights that we want and need. And as you can see, I'm painting mainly towards the top parts of the nails, which are nearest the light. Now at the end here, I've come back with green ochre as a glaze, just to really sort of unify all the colours of these elements together and give it this really lovely smoothing effect.